podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Hey, Brian, welcome to the show.
What's up, Mark? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. So it's Halloween week. We're here to talk about the dead, not ghouls and ghosts, but the Grateful Dead. They're a band, but a lot of people may not know who they are and what it is and why they were so influential.
Yeah. The Grateful Dead to this day are an enduring phenomena in the culture. Of course, they were a psychedelic dance band that got going in the mid-1960s, which is kind of where this book that I just put out, that's sort of where the narrative begins. But the interesting thing about the Grateful Dead is that, the band ran for 30 years. That was like their proper run, 1965 to 1995. And then the band, ceased to exist when Jerry Garcia died. But in the time since, the Dead and sort of all it represents has just kind of continued to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. There's really kind of nothing else like it. A very singular force, not just in music, but really in American culture. In Loud and Clear, this book that I spent many years working on and put out a couple months ago, it tells the story of this gigantic custom PA or public address system that the Grateful Dead built over a number of years, beginning in the late 60s and then in the early to mid 70s is really when it reached its full expression. And it's known as the Wall of Sound, not to be confused with Phil Spector's recording technique or production technique, rather, that's known by the same name. But the Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound was a groundbreaking piece of technology, which I get into in the book. But what I found myself doing, reporting and writing the book, was kind of telling the story of this band through the lens of this giant mountain of speakers and amplifiers that steadily grew behind them over a number of years. And I actually own a piece of this gigantic sound system. It's right behind me. There it is.
Nice.
Yes. And in the book, I sort of use my acquisition of this piece, this historical artifact, as a window to tell this much bigger story about obsession and titanic human achievement in the Grateful Dead's quest to achieve audio perfection.
And how big is the Wall of Sound, just for people to visualize who haven't seen a picture of it?
Right. So it was gigantic. And I think, the context is key here. So in the mid-60s, when the Dead got going, let alone 1974, when the Wall of Sound reached its apex, no one was doing anything like this. There was no other band that was building, its own custom sound system to this scale. So I can sort of give you an idea of how the Dead sound system sort of grew and evolved and morphed over the years into the full Wall of Sound. And I'll kind of give you all of the specs there. But in 1965, which is when the Grateful Dead formed, the band's rig, all of their instruments and all of their sound gear weighed 800 pounds. And it was transported in drummer Bill Kreutzmann's station wagon. So very humble beginnings, right? Very kind of punk rock. By 1967, 2 years later, the Grateful Dead's rig weighed 1,300 pounds. And by that time, it was being carted around in a van that was owned by the band's very first roadie, a childhood friend of Jerry Garcia's named Laird Grant. A year later, by 1968, the Dead's rig came in at 6,000 pounds. So it took a bit of a jump there. And by that point, it was being schlepped around in a metro van. By 1970, 2 years later, the Dead's rig weighed 10,000 pounds and was being carted around the country in their own 18-foot box truck. By 1973, 3 years later, they take a big jump. And by 1973, the Dead's custom sound system had kind of clearly taken the shape of a prototype wall of sound. And the rig at that point weighed 30,000 pounds and was being transported in a dedicated 40-foot truck. And the Dead also had their own lighting rig that was carried in its own 18-foot truck. They also realized over the years that they couldn't rely on the venues that they were playing in to supply enough juice, like enough electricity to power this monstrosity, right? So they were carrying essentially their own power plant with them too. So by 1973, they were carrying enough generators to light up 6 blocks of tract homes. So that's like a lot of power that they were carrying with themselves every show.
For one 10-person band.
Exactly, right. And then by 1974, a year later, this is sort of peak wall of sound. The Grateful Dead's system, including hundreds of custom speaker cabinets like the one that I now own, dozens of heavy-duty Macintosh amplifiers, and 2 identical sets of custom staging and scaffolding to put all of this stuff in. All of that stuff clocked in at around 75 tons. And by that summer, the load was even pushing 80 tons. And, at indoor venues, this stage plot would run about 60 to 70 feet wide, 3 to 4 stories tall, and about 40 feet deep. And on outdoor stages, it was even wider. It would run to around 100 feet wide.
Oh my goodness!
4 stories tall.
It's like it was described as a spaceship.
If you look at photos of it, it's kind of got that look. It looks like a gigantic spaceship. Years later, before it kind of had become known as the Wall of Sound, Grateful Dead bassist Phil Lesh referred to it as the Rocket Gantry system, which I really like. But yeah, it does have this like kind of spaceship quality to it. So by 1974, right, peak Wall of Sound, it comprised 600 plus speakers, right, dozens of heavy duty amplifiers, gobs of tweeters. And, no other band, like I mentioned, was approaching anything even remotely at this scale at the time. And keep in mind, too, there was a gas crisis. There was a fuel crisis on at the time. So the cost of just fueling up the fleet of semi-trucks that it took to cart all of this stuff around was astronomical. And the Dead also found themselves having to pay rent at 2 venues simultaneously. Because like I mentioned, they had 2 identical sets of staging and scaffolding for all of this gear. And they had 2 crews that would leapfrog across the country. So that when crew A would roll into a given venue in a given town, crew B would have already set up all of the staging and scaffolding to house all of this gear. And then they would switch places and leapfrog across the country. So the organization would have to pay rent at 2 places simultaneously quite often. So all of that is to say, it reached a certain point in 1974 where the writing was sort of on the wall, if you can forgive the pun there. And the band and the organization realized that this wasn't going to be sustainable, so they were going to have to shut all of it down. But that sort of gives you the progression of of how the Dead system was built up over a number of years into this full gigantic unified backline, this gigantic wall of speakers. And one thing I try to illuminate in the book is that the wall of sound as we know it today didn't just drop out of the clear blue sky one day, fully formed in 1974. It was really the culmination and the apex of this years-long project that really began at the beginning of the band. So I knew when I was setting out to write this book that I was going to have to begin in 1965 when the band got going. So that's sort of where the narrative begins. And then you sort of go on this whole journey as this thing grows and as they, through trial and error, pick up little bits of knowledge here and there as they're grinding out tour dates on the road, right? So the meat of the book really comprises this first kind of grand 10-year era of the band from 1965 through the end of 1974.
So 80 tons of gear, you're basically moving a factory every night, and all the people and the crew and the transportation of the trucks to make it happen. I guess the big question is, why? Is it, you mentioned human achievement? Is it technology, advancement of technology? Is it artistry?
Yeah.
Hubris?
I think it was all of those things. The Dead had this sort of why not mentality that kind of propelled them. And I think there was a couple things at work. They had an ethic from the very beginning about what they owed to their fans, the people who would come up to see them perform. And this really goes back to the acid tests. And the acid tests were these psychedelic fueled audio-visual happenings that took place along the West Coast from Portland down to Los Angeles over just 2 months, really, at the end of 1965 and early 1966. And they were organized by the author Ken Kesey and his band of merry pranksters who were kind of a roving performance art troupe who took LSD as a sacrament. And they became buddies with, they weren't even known as the Grateful Dead yet. They were still known as the Warlocks. And they became friends. And the Dead, they soon changed their name, were basically the house band at the acid tests. And the thing about the acid tests is that the performers and the audience were all sort of traveling together, so to speak. There were no barriers between performer and audience. An audience member was just as much a performer in the same way a performer was just as much as an audience member. So it was just like everyone at the acid test were in the same sonic envelope traveling together. And that really kind of set the blueprint that the Dead would follow for the rest of their career. But you would see it sort of like culminate in the Wall of Sound, because in the Wall, they moved the monitor speakers that are typically at a musician's feet, right? And monitor speakers fold back the sound so that a performer can hear themselves playing.
They're called wedges in the industry, and they look like wedges.
Yes, wedges. So within the Wall of Sound, they moved all of the wedges, all of the monitors behind the musicians so that this gigantic wall behind them was their monitors and it was their PA. And what that did was that eliminated any barriers between the band and the audience so that the musicians and the crowd all heard the exact same thing. So I think that was a big driver that led to the Wall of Sound was, the audience and the band being this single organism, right? But also the Dead had this another ethic from the very beginning to always funnel money and earnings back into better sound system gear. And you can see that from the very beginning of the band. And again, the context is key here. In the mid-60s, when this band got going, there was no such thing as a musical PA. And if you go to see a band perform, the sound was atrocious. And, until the Dead came along, it wasn't even like, you know, the quality of sound in a live setting. It's not even like it was an afterthought. It wasn't even a thought yet. Like people just weren't paying attention to, uh, putting on like sort of the best presentation of their sound as possible. And then along came the Grateful Dead and their original sound man, Owsley Bear Stanley, who's a real kind of key character in this book. And his influence came on really strong and really fast. He first saw the Dead at one of these early acid tests and kind of quickly like ingratiated himself with them. And he had some prior service related ham radio experience, and he was also pretty well moneyed. So he started kitting them out with the best sound system gear possible.
He was a patron of the band.
Exactly. He was their early patron, their earliest patron. And he really gave them like a leg up on any other band going at the time. So yeah, like you were asking like, like why? And I think it was because no one had paid any attention to, just elevating the experience for the audience and for the band through like higher quality sound. And also, an effort to preserve, that sort of like symbiotic single organism model of the band and the crowd being like one thing, right? I think kind of all of that like steadily evolved into the Wall of Sound, and it would like so many other things in Dead World, it was like this kind of natural progression, just as each year went by, you know, more and more audio wizards and sound consultant folks were, kind of entered the fold and were coming to the table to work with the band to achieve this shared goal, right? So it's this whole crazy cast of characters in the book. And, I set out to speak to as many of them as I possibly could who would want to talk to me. And you can see if you read the book that, the band members themselves obviously are there in the narrative, but it's like they kind of like flit in and out of the story. And the principal characters in the book are really more so the infamous Grateful Dead crew and all of the technicians, right? And these sound consultant and audio wizard types who were kind of working behind the scenes to build this thing up. And
they were famous for hiring the Hells Angels for security as well.
They did, yes. So the Dead had a really interesting relationship with biker gangs in the Bay Area in the mid to late 60s, quite often at, big free shows that the band would put on in Golden Gate Park or the Panhandle, right? Quite often the Hells Angels would, they would kind of just be like the default security at a lot of those free shows. They would, guard the generator that was powering the sound system. They would even, look after lost children, right? Like they're the Hells Angels. They're like a rough and tumble, at times pretty sketchy bunch. But more often than not, they were sort of, they were kind of keeping the peace. And I don't think the Dead ever actually, formally hired them, but the famous event being Altamont, the Altamont Free concert at the end of the 60s, where the Hells Angels were basically given free booze to kind of act as the stage security at that doomed concert. And that show sort of ends. Is it chapter? I think it's chapter 5 in the book. Altamont is sort of like the closing scene of that chapter.
And it was considered one of the closing scenes of the 60s, was it not as well?
It really was. Yeah. I mean, it was a response to Woodstock, which happened just a couple months before, right? Which is like, you know,
Peace and love, and
the model of just like the peace and love, like free concert, right? And the Rolling Stones came along and they were filming a movie and they thought it would make a splashy ending to their film if they threw this free concert. So it was sort of the Stones were like leading the charge there. Uh, but they decided to do it on the West Coast, and the Dead sort of naturally kind of got involved. And yeah, I think like symbolically, it really kind of like signified an end to an era, and it also sort of signified an end to an era within the Grateful Dead organization, and also the sound system too. Like when the '60s closed and the '70s opened, like in the narrative in the book, you can see that like there was a big shift in how the Dead were like building out and actualizing this what would be this like gigantic sound system, right? But yeah, I mean, all sorts of crazy characters from the Hells Angels to like, you know, some of the high school dropouts who were their roadies, right? Or
yeah,
some of
and
the
they
sound.
were
Yeah.
And they were really tech pioneers. I mean,
Oh,
yeah, not
absolutely.
not only, in terms of sound, but also, maybe we could talk about taping. I mean, Wired has said that they're pioneers. John Perry Barlow, one of their or I should say, one of their songwriters, was
Yeah.
the founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I mean, they almost created the open source ethos that we know as the modern internet.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's this misconception that a lot of people have, maybe folks who aren't super familiar with the Dead, maybe they know their one top 40 hit, right? Maybe they know Touch of
Yeah,
Grey, right?
right.
Which was kind of I don't even approach that era in the book. Like I said, the book is like the first 10 years of this band. Touch of Grey was a fluke hit that happened 20 years into their career. But for folks who really kind of have only a passing familiarity with the Grateful Dead, they might have this image in their mind of Jerry Garcia, this like kind of woolly hippie wearing a drug rug poncho, sitting by the riverside, playing Uncle John's band, strumming an acoustic guitar, right? And yeah, that's a part of it. But really, Garcia and like the rest of the Dead organization and everyone else who was working with them were always about like experimentation, pushing things as far as they could go, really like embracing the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of technology. And yeah, there's sort of a line in the book in a later chapter that I kind of keep coming back to. I write, "It's a dead world. We're just living in it." And, just thinking about like the enduring legacy of this band, um, right, in terms of, you know, sound reinforcement as we know it today, so much can trace directly back to what the Dead were doing with the wall of sound, right? But also, just in terms of, right, sort of like our notion of like free when it comes to the internet, right? And just like a free exchange of information. Yeah, you can see that in the Grateful Dead taper community, right? Of course, you mentioned John Perry Barlow, who was sort of an early cyber libertarian and was
Yeah.
instrumental in starting the Electronic Frontier Foundation. There's so many other aspects of the Dead phenomena that we can see just in our modern world. It's kind of staggering, and I think yeah, a lot of people who maybe don't have like or who rather only have a passing familiarity just kind of have no idea that like again so much of our modern world was kind of created and forged by this band in kind of an unlikely way. It might sort of surprise people if they read this book to, you know, find out some of the ways that, sound reinforcement is sort of the focus of this book. But anyone who goes to see live music today, from like a stadium on down to a little beer soaked, rock and roll club, is going to see and experience like echoes and reverberations of what the dead were up to, kind of
How about
back.
the sphere? You
Even the
talk about the
sphere,
sphere towards the end of your book. I mean, I'm
yeah,
sure there's a direct line from.
absolutely. From the wall of sound, yeah, to the sphere. There's another line in the book. I say the wall of sound walked so that the sphere could run. So when you go into the sphere, the sound system in that space is similarly deploying a point source approach to sound, and that's the same approach that the wall of sound used. So, the acoustical concept of point source is when a speaker system produces from a single source the full range of sound. So that's sort of the model that the wall of sound was based off of, and also with the sphere. But instead of 600 some odd speakers, which is what the wall of sound represented, in the sphere you have 160 some odd 160,000, excuse me, some odd speakers. So it's like it's the wall of sound, but just taken to the nth degree, right? And similar to the wall of sound in the sphere, the whole sound system is at the musicians' backs. It's behind them, and some of it is actually underneath them too. But that's sort of the same idea. Is like all of the sound system is behind the band,
Right.
and you even see too some other similarities um, between what the Dead were up to in the early '70s with the Wall of Sound and something like the Sphere. Even like the shape of the Sphere. When I went there for the first time in 2024, and I sort of talk about that at the end of the book, when I was walking into like this giant dome, right? Uh, I couldn't help but think of a project that the Dead wanted to get off the ground in the early '70s called Dead Patch. And the idea behind Dead Patch was to have their own performance space, their own performance center, um, somewhere in the Bay Area, somewhere in Marin County.
So
And
dead patch like pumpkin patch.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Dead Patch. Yeah.
Okay.
They
Okay.
wanted to have Dead Patch. And at Dead Patch, one of the things that they were going to do is they were going to have a performance space where like the acoustics were perfectly dialed in and they could set up their sound system just exactly perfect, and people could come to see them perform there, and they wouldn't have to like tour with this gigantic manifest of gear. Now
Yeah.
that project never got off the ground, but they were taking it very seriously. And at one point, when they were thinking about like what shape this performance space should take, they were thinking about a Buckminster Fuller style geodesic dome,
Oh, really? Okay.
which is just a sphere. And
Yeah.
they even had like some initial plans drawn up of like this geodesic dome that they wanted to put their sound system in. So like here I was walking into the sphere in 2024 for the first time, and it's like, here's their sphere. Like here's the dome that they wanted to build 50 years ago. So yeah, you could draw like this perfect 50-year technological arc from the Wall of Sound to the Sphere, which opened in 2024. So 1974 to 2024. So yeah, there's all these kind of reverberations and like echoes that I sort of couldn't help but notice in the book when I was going to like this super high tech space like the Sphere, right?
I mean, in the sphere, the best thing about it is you don't have to take it down every night. And, that got me thinking towards the end of the book. I mean, it was an experiment. So, no experiment, I guess, is a failure. It's only a failure if you haven't done it. But I mean, the band essentially broke up for over a year after this. So, I mean, was it
Yeah.
worth it?
Yeah. I mean, it was. But to your point, the Wall of Sound, it broke the band and like their crazy cast of crew and all the sound technicians and all these people who were on the payroll, dozens and dozens of people. The Wall of Sound really kind of broke them financially, spiritually, physically, mentally. Like it was such a grind to keep this thing going on the road. Such a physical grind to like set it all up, tear it down, drive to the next show. But also just like a financial grind. You know, they were basically burning money to keep this thing going. So much so that by the middle of 1974, there were a series of band meetings that were called, and the Dead quite often would have band meetings. But it wasn't just the band members at these meetings. It was like everyone. So like dozens of people were invited to these get-togethers where there would be kind of like maybe a loose, like a loose couple of agenda items, but it wasn't
Family
just like,
gathering more than anything else.
exactly. It was just like everyone just kind of hanging out, just like spitballing ideas, whatever. But there was this series of meetings in summer of 1974 where it was one of the band's early co-managers, an individual by the name of Danny Rifkin, who sort of morphed into more of like a roadie by the time the Wall of Sound was going. And it was Danny Rifkin who stood up at one of these meetings and he said, this just is not fun anymore. And that was another MO from the very beginning of the Grateful Dead. Like, you hear Jerry Garcia talk about this in numerous interviews. Like, it was just all about having fun. It's all about, that was like the whole point. Like, if it wasn't fun, like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
And so Danny Rifkin stands up and he's like, this just isn't fun anymore. And I think that's sort of like, clearly a lot of other people were feeling the same way, but they needed one person to stand up to be like, guys, this just is not fun. And then quickly everyone else was like, okay, we're happy someone said something because like, we're all
Wow.
really
Yeah.
burnt out too. But the part that I love and the part that really embodies like the kind of go for it, why not attitude that propelled the Grateful Dead is that they have these meetings where it's like, this isn't fun anymore. We need to shut it down and go on hiatus. But first, we need to take the Wall of Sound to Europe and tour it over there. So that's what they did in September of 1974. They brought like a streamlined version of the Wall over to Europe, which just, again, like for the time, imagine the logistics of pulling that off.
Imagine doing that today. Imagine doing that today and not 50 years ago.
Exactly, right. But they figured it out. They didn't rent any gear. Like, quite often now, if like, bigger bands are going to be touring Europe, they bring their instruments, but a lot of like the sound reinforcement gear, that's all going to be rented, like over there. But they're
just plugging in.
Exactly. But the Dead brought all of this stuff with them, and writing through that Europe 74 tour was like, I mean, some of the shenanigans that were going behind the scenes were like just pretty outrageous. But they came back from that short tour and then they did 5 more shows with the Wall of Sound at the Winterland in San Francisco. And then that was it. They kind of literally pulled the plug on the sound system. And then the Grateful Dead entered a new and stranger era. And that was sort of like, end scene on the first phase of the Grateful Dead. And then once they came back they took an 18-month hiatus. Once they came back from that, like things were a lot different.
And in the musical world too. I mean, there's a huge change in music in 1974 to 1976. You went from, to me, that's the end of the 60s, at least in the musical sense of that era. You get to 74, and then by 1976, we're talking disco.
Disco starting to creep in, yeah, and like that bug bit the Dead too. Shakedown Street, like so many bands, it was like we're starting to do like the 4 on the floor kind of disco thing. So yeah, things were much different when they came back. And, even just from like, musically it was different, but just in terms of, like sound reinforcement, it was like the world kind of caught up to the Grateful Dead when they came back from their hiatus. In 1976, when they started touring again, they realized that they didn't have to carry around 80 tons worth of gear with them. They could,
It
they
it's
could
like
rent.
being obese and losing weight.
Exactly. Right. They realized they didn't need to cart all of this stuff around with them, because, the state of the art, was such that they could rent, a streamlined sound reinforcement setup, um, that was just as high quality, if not even higher quality than the Wall of Sound. But that's not to take away from like the clarity that the Wall of Sound is known for. But again, it's like the state of the industry and the state of the art kind of caught up to the Grateful Dead, because the Grateful Dead sort of like blazed this path. Um, but but yeah, I sort of talk about in the book in the later chapters, like after the hiatus, what happened to all of this stuff? Like all of
Yeah.
these tons of gear, like where did it go? So,
Yeah, it's one of the coolest parts. Tell us about
oh,
it.
cool. Yeah, I'm glad you like that. Yeah, that was sort of like a motivating question. Like after I wrote through the narrative, like through the end of 1974, it was like, well, where is this stuff? All of this hardware, like where is it? What happened to it? And you'll see in the narrative, I sort of follow a handful of streams through which this gear kind of entered, uh, or sort of like eked out into the real world. And one of those streams was that the band bequeathed some of this gear to smaller Bay Area bands
Yeah.
who, could use some help, use some gear, right? So the Dead gave a decent amount of the Wall of Sound gear away to smaller bands, right? To sort of outfit their bands. And I think that's very in the spirit, like in the giving spirit of the Grateful Dead,
Yeah. You called it sponsoring young musicians. I mean, it's almost like what Bear did, 30
Exactly.
or years prior when he
Exactly.
was their patron and, they returned the favor. Good
Exactly.
karma.
Exactly, for sure. So like, a decent amount of the Wall of Sound gear went to outfit smaller bands. Uh, some of it also went into the home hi-fi stereo setups of any number of the Grateful Dead roadies, right? So like when the hiatus was called at the end of 1974, basically everyone was laid off. All of the road crew were basically told, "Hey, we're taking a break. We don't know how long it's going to be. So go find work somewhere else." But what ended up happening is quite a few of the roadies, they would take a speaker cabinet here, a speaker cabinet there, maybe an amplifier from the Wall of Sound, and that would go into their home hi-fi setup. So they would have like a
Right.
sick home hi-fi setup. Um, but by the end of the 70s, this gear was just kind of considered out, like kind of slightly antiquated, just like old gear, So like
Yeah.
there was higher quality, like, um, you know, home hi-fi, like consumer kind of grade gear that was on the market by that point. So a few of the Grateful Dead roadies who I spoke to who took gear from the Wall of Sound, they were all like, yeah, by the end of the 70s, I traded that stuff, um, for, one guy I spoke to was like, yeah, I traded my Wall of Sound stuff for some like some landscaping work. He just like gave it to a
Okay.
landscaper. And then like another sort of sound technician who was working with the Grateful Dead in this era sold this stuff in a garage sale. Like people didn't have any idea what this thing would go on to become, right? So
Right.
quite a few of those people, they would tell me like, I wish I maybe held on to some of that stuff, right? So that's like another stream that this stuff followed out into it sort of eked out into the real world. Um, Some of it went into storage at the Grateful Dead warehouse in Northern California. Some of it got repurposed into like later iterations of the Grateful Dead sound system. So like in the late 70s, like, you know, parts of the Wall of Sound were sort of like, you know, brought out of storage for some like crazy sort of sound experiment shows in the Bay Area. Um, but then there's also, I don't want to uh, wade into like any spoiler territory here, but there's another stream through which some of this stuff um, met maybe you know, sort of a maybe like a darker fate, I guess. I'll sort of frame it as. I sort of picked up some intel that, you know, some of the Wall of Sound was at a later date consigned to the Marin County dump, but this stuff actually didn't end up in the dump. Something else happened to it. So you'll sort of have to read to find out like what happened there.
Mhm.
But another story that I love about what happened to some of this stuff is that Lawrence Shirtliff, aka Ramrod, who was sort of like the roadie's roadie. He was like the conscience of the Grateful Dead. Garcia called Ramrod the high water integrity marker. And he joined the Dead organization in 1967, 68 as a roadie. And then he was on through the very end. And he would eventually graduate to, you know, president of the Grateful Dead organization. But after the Wall of Sound, quite a few of Phil Lesh's gigantic bass cabinets were repurposed into chicken coops at Ramrod's farm, which
Should have been
I just,
ignoble ending.
yeah, exactly. And there's supposedly some photos of Phil Lesh's bass cabs with, you know, hens roosting in them. But yeah, it was fun to sort of like track down some of this stuff. And today there's not many original pieces of the Wall of Sound that survive to this day, you know? Like entropy, stuff breaks down, stuff gets water damaged, right? And to own a little piece of it here, which is sitting in my office, is mind blowing. And I acquired this piece through a Sotheby's auction,
Wow.
and yeah, in 2021, it was late 2021. Sotheby's partnered with Grateful Dead Productions to auction off 150 some odd items or lots from the Grateful Dead's Northern California warehouse. So, like old decommissioned gear, but also just other sort of bits of ephemera that were kind of laying around. And for whatever reason, I didn't bother to start scrolling through the lots. This was a digital, like a remote auction. So it wasn't like I was in like, you know, in the
Gotcha.
room that's holding up the paddles with the numbers on it, right? Like I'm just sitting on my laptop and I start scrolling through the lots the night before bidding closed. I think there was 24 hours remaining to place a bid. And I start scrolling through this stuff. And of course, immediately I'm like, wow, this stuff is really neat, right? But I don't have $250,000 to bid on Garcia's famous Budman amplifier, which was in his Wall of Sound rig. It's known as Budman because a Budweiser sticker, Ramrod actually put a Budman sticker on this one amplifier. That amplifier ended up going for $250,000. I don't have that kind of budget, but I'm scrolling through and I'm like, I wonder what item has the lowest starting bid. And ended up being this Wall of Sound cabinet that I now own. I think the starting bid was $800 and
Reasonable.
reasonable, right? I was like, okay. And what was really interesting is compared with some of the other items in this auction, like specifically Wall of Sound, like decommissioned Wall of Sound gear, some of those other items had really detailed descriptions. It was like uh speaker cabinet used in the Wall of Sound, and like it had a lot of intel provided by another roadie that I spoke to in the book. Big Steve Parrish sort of gave Sotheby's information about a lot of these items. But this lot here that I won, the description was super bare bones. So all it said was monitor speaker used on stage. That's all it
That's it.
said. But
Wow.
looking at the condition and the vintage of this cabinet in the really high end photos that Sotheby's posted, I had a hunch just because I had looked at enough photos of the Wall of Sound by that point. I had this hunch that, I think this is from that 73, 74 era. I'm pretty sure this was from the Wall of Sound. So I placed a bid,
That's a
and
big gamble.
it's a big gamble. And I had the leading bid for like 23 hours, but it was just in that last hour that it was me and someone else out there who were just like going tit for tat. And like the price like quickly escalated, but it got to a point where I was fully committed. I was like, I'm going to get this thing. So I ended up winning it, and
Nice.
I had it shipped to my childhood home out in the suburbs of Chicago because it was
Mhm.
cheaper to ship it there than it was to ship it to my apartment here in the city. And I was able to have both of my parents there for like the unboxing. And if you read the book, you can see that my parents are characters in this book too. And so it was really special to have them on hand when this giant wooden crate looking like something out of like an Indiana Jones movie showed
Right.
up at their house. And we like open it up and like, let's see what's inside. So I knew when that was happening that that was the opening scene of the book. I was
Yeah.
like, just everything about it. I'm like, this is it. The book will begin and end in present day. It begins with this artifact showing up, and we open up the box and I stick my head inside, and that's like the window to launch us into this much bigger story. And then at the end of the narrative, we kind of come back around to present day when I'm like trying to track down some other surviving bits of the Wall of Sound. But it was really cool to sort of connect with other like keepers, as I call them, like keepers of
Yeah.
the Wall of Sound. There's this network, this community of people out there, uh, super far flung, like across the country, across the world, who have through various means sort of acquired little bits of this sound system. So to connect with them was really cool.
Cool.
And I actually just here the story this story just kind of keeps like unfolding. And just a couple weeks ago, a source from the book sent me this speaker cone that was part of like the very early Wall of Sound, dating back to like 1970 to 1973. Um, this was part of it. This speaker cone here, and he was like, "I want you to have this. It was going to end up like in the dump, and it should go to
Cool.
you." So this stuff, it just stuff is starting to come out of the woodwork now that like the book is out. Like it just kind of keeps
Yeah.
it kind of keeps evolving. So this is another very special thing to have. The source called it a
Yeah.
trinket. I think about like all of the places that this thing went and where like the big artifact went, the thousands of miles that these things clocked,
Yeah.
all of the hundreds of thousands of people who like received the signals coming out of these artifacts, including my parents who were at like, you know, certain Wall of Sound proper shows and like shows kind of leading into that 1974 year. Yeah, like these are really, to me, like very kind of like sacred objects to have. To other people, they might just be, pieces of junk, and they kind of are. It's just like old busted gear. But these are like little bits of history. So it's
Yeah.
kind of cool to own some of this stuff and just kind of vibe out with it in my office.
So what do you think's next for the Dead? I mean, will it live on forever? Yeah, we've got Dead and Co. now. We've got, so many enthusiasts and, gear and all that, and people like
Mhm.
yourself who are keeping this stuff alive for
Yeah,
forever, maybe.
for sure. Yeah, I like to think of the Grateful Dead as a socio-political, musical atomic bomb that detonated in the mid 1960s. And the chain reaction has just continued to accelerate. And like the blast zone just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Like I don't think the Grateful Dead, who again ended in their proper form in 1995, I don't think they've been bigger than they are right now, just in
I
terms of
know.
like the songbook being sort of like uh the songbook is like this living, breathing thing, right? So you have Dead and Company, you have a whole number of like kind of offshoot bands that occurred post Grateful Dead.
And I
Um,
feel like they're more respected than ever.
yeah, I think what's happening is that for a long time it was not cool to be into the Grateful Dead. Um, I think there's the stereotype of the deadhead, right? Like just kind of a burnout who's like just wants to like take acid and listen to like noodly music. But I think like a lot of people have realized that for any number of reasons, like you were talking about, the Dead were so kind of like trailblazing, and like they're owed a lot of respect, right? And I think they're kind of having like this kind of glow up right now. And there's a whole
For
new
sure.
generation of young people who are discovering Grateful Dead music because there's this massive archive of freely available live recordings of the Dead that anyone can access. So there's like this whole young generation of people who are sort of turning on to the Grateful Dead. And there was a really great moment in this past August. I was out in San Francisco for GD 60, the big like 60th anniversary celebration of the Grateful Dead. Dead and Company did 3 nights in Golden Gate Park, right? So there's like Golden Gate Park, kind of hollowed ground, right? They did a lot of free shows back in the late 60s in Golden Gate Park. And I was talking with John Meyer, not John Mayer, John Meyer. And John Meyer is another character in the book. He's an audio engineer who was sort of orbiting the Dead in the late 60s and early 70s and sort of like, giving them some feedback on what they were up to as they were building the Wall of Sound. But then at the end of the 70s, John Meyer and his wife Helen started their own sound company, Meyer Sound. And the Dead linked up with Meyer Sound, and Meyer was their sound system provider through the very end. So Meyer Sound has like a very tight connection to the Dead. But I'm hanging out with John Meyer at these shows, and he was making the point that long after we're all dead, hundreds of years into the future, people are still going to be listening and performing and studying Grateful Dead music in the way that we listen to and perform and study classical music today. And I think that's just like a
Yeah.
perfect way to think about it. It's just always going to be out there, and it's going to outlive all of us. And
Yeah.
again, there's just like really no other force like that uh, in certainly like in American rock music. There's other bands that like the music will live on to a degree, but like the Dead, it's just like they were this whole world building project, and it's not slowing down. People are coming to it and like putting their own spin on it, right? So
Mm.
my book was just one of like a handful of books about the Grateful Dead that came out this year. So it's
Wow.
like it's this phenomenon that you can dig into, and it's truly bottomless. You
Yeah.
can just keep
Yeah.
digging and digging and digging into it. It's really amazing.
Well, the book is called The Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound and the Quest for Audio Perfection by Brian Anderson. Loud and Clear is the main title. How can people find out more about you? You have a website?
You know, I should have a website. But I'm on all the socials, so you can find me on
That's all you
Instagram.
need.
You can find me on Facebook. Haven't been active on Twitter in a very long time. I'm on Blue Sky. If anyone's out on Blue Sky,
All right.
you can easily find me there. My DMs are open. You can email me. I have my email listed on all of my social sites. And, the book is available everywhere. So wherever
All right.
you're comfortable looking it up, it's out there.
All right. Well, Brian, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.